Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by DISA Global Solutions. DISA Global Solutions has over 25 years of experience. They are active in the global market for over 2 years and specialize in providing safety and compliance solutions to safety-sensitive employers. Among their many services, they include full-service global provider of consolidated services including drug and alcohol testing, background screening, occupational health screening, transportation compliance, and safety training, and provide these services to over 11,000 clients' companies. Today's presentation is entitled International Drug Testing Policies, Still the Cornerstone of an Effective Program, and will be presented by Bill Current and Sean Stell. Bill Current is the president and founder of WFC & Associates, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and providing accurate and up-to-date state drug testing law information. He is the editor of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com and the publisher of the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly and the weekly e-news service Drug Testing in the News. He is the author or co-author of 10 books on substance abuse issues, including Why Drug Testing. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 16th year. Sean Stell is DISA's international coordinator and has been with DISA for over 5 years. He serves as a senior account representative in DISA's Client Services Department before being selected to manage the international testing process. He also trains and coordinates clinics of over 30 countries for drug testing and occupational health. Sean assists with drug testing policy implementation and compliance in Canada, South America, and Australia, and also works to expand DISA's occupational medical record tracking to include medical compliance for Canada, the UK, and Norway. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current and Sean Stell.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and welcome to everybody who is on today's webinar. It is a pleasure to once again be involved in another DISA International webinar. Really, to my knowledge, and I do a lot of webinars, and we host a lot of webinars here at WFC & Associates, this is the only series of international webinars that I'm aware of. So this is a great way to find out what's going on throughout the world and, excuse me, how to make drug testing programs work globally. So our hats off to DISA for this wonderful webinar service. Also, I'm not sure if the word has gotten completely out, but earlier this week, DISA announced the acquisition of yet another European-based drug testing and health care provider, health services provider, RS Occupational Health, which is headquartered in Aberdeen, Scotland, and they have been a leading provider of occ health services over the last decade. And you see on the list here a number of the services that they provide. But this is going to significantly expand the depth and the breadth of the services that DISA provides in Europe to go along with other locations that they have in Europe, especially in the North Sea region, in providing services to oil and gas companies and other companies that support offshore service drilling and whatnot in the North Sea area. So this is a pretty significant acquisition, and wanted to point that out. I think some of you may also be aware that DISA puts out a quarterly newsletter on international drug testing issues. Perhaps many of you on today's webinar receive it. If you don't, though, subscriptions are free, and you can join the mailing list by using going to the international page at disa.com, or you can simply call using the number there to the left of the screen. And if there are any topics, international related topics that you'd like covered in the email, in the newsletter, just let them know. I've had the pleasure of writing some of the articles for the newsletter, and again, it's one of the ways of kind of connecting the community when it comes to international employee screening services and programs and laws and other regulations that apply. So if you're interested, please feel free to sign up. And then, of course, let me just put a plug in for IFDAT, the International Forum for Drug and Alcohol Testing. Their annual conference will be in September of this year in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Last year it was in Miami. This year it will be in Ireland, and there will be speakers from all over the world speaking on international drug testing issues. So If you can make it, I'm sure they'd love to have you visit their website and find out more about that. So today we're going to talk about drug testing policies from an international perspective. Now, of course, as you know, a lot of the basics of a good drug testing policy are going to be the same regardless of where you are. But there are things that come into play internationally that are not necessarily going to influence a drug testing policy in the United States. But there's a lot of overlapping. Internationally, like for example, here in the United States, you're going to have, if in a non-DOT mandated policy, for example, so that's a policy that's not mandated by the U.S. Department of Transportation, you're going to have state laws that affect how you put that policy together. And I often get asked the question, we're based in Texas, but we're in 37 different states. Which state law applies to us? And the answer is all of them. And so you would be required to comply with any kind of state law requirements for Texas as your headquarter state, but then in addition to that, comply with all the other state laws that where you have business operations. Well, the same is true internationally, except you're typically not going to find a country divided by state or provincial laws. They're usually, in other countries, they're going to be regulated at the national level. Many countries, however, do not have national drug testing laws, similar to what we might see in a state, or even what we might see, what we're used to seeing with the Department of Transportation, for example. And so other legal requirements come into play. Labor agreements, health codes and health regulations, privacy laws, a very, very big deal, not just in Europe, but in other countries as well. Legal rulings, we call them court summaries or lawsuits here in the United States, but legal rulings are very, very prominent in terms of how you put your policy together in another country, because they typically don't have, as I said, national drug testing laws that would apply in a country. Some do, though, and so it's always important to check out all of those, the different national laws that would apply to you, and within a different country, the different laws, regulations, labor agreements, etc., that could influence how you do drug testing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that within the scope of what a drug testing policy would typically have in it. So in a lead into that, we're not going to spend a lot of time on these next few slides, but we wanted to provide them to you so that as you review these slides later, you'll have an opportunity to, look at the numbers. There are a lot of statistics from around the world, and it would be, we could do an entire webinar just on drug abuse trends by countries or by sections of the world. I've just pulled out a few from some global organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO, from a recent report that they issued showing the levels of drug abuse, including the misuse of alcohol and the effect that it has. I've underscored a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to. According to the World Health Organization, there are 148 countries that report drug use by injection, and of course, many of those countries, the vast majority of them, also report HIV infection in their population. 155 to 250 million people, up to 5.7% of the world population, admit to using psychoactive substances, and in the World Health Organization definition of a psychoactive substance, that's marijuana, that's amphetamines, cocaine, opiates, and even non-prescribed psychoactive medications. So they're talking about drug abuse. 129 to 190 million people use marijuana. And so when we look at the U.S. report that comes out from the federal government every year, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which is sort of that is the report for U.S. drug use trends. Our numbers dwarf, which you would expect, of course. Our numbers dwarf by comparison to the world numbers, but we do play a significant part in those world numbers. We would have somewhere right around 25 million in the United States who admit to being current illicit drug users. So that second to last bullet, we would be, somewhere around 10% of the total number if it was up to 250 million. We would be a significant part of that. In 2012, there was a report that was called the 2012 World Drug Report that estimated that there were 230 million people, or 5% of the world's population, using illicit drugs in 2010. marijuana, of course, was the most widely used drug. Seizures of methamphetamines doubled between 2008 and 2010, as was the rate of ecstasy pill seizures by authorities in Europe. I'm not going to go through all of these, but some of this you're going to kind of recognize as a reflection of what's going on in the United States. The UN uses the term new psychoactive substances, and they measure that. It would be very similar to a portion of the report here in the United States that talks about the misuse of psychotherapeutic drugs. This is talking about the expansion of the actual drugs that are being made worldwide, and it shows that the number of these new psychoactive substances, MPS, has increased from 166 in 2009 to 251 by 2012, a fairly significant increase, of course. And then on this next slide, I thought you'd find this interesting. Again, this deals with prescription drug abuse globally. Heroin, good news, of course, heroin use, at least by the standards of measurement that they're using in Europe, have decreased over the last several years. But the misuse of other prescription drugs, including some opiates like OxyContin, have actually not decreased. They've sort of remained steady at about 16 million users. This is in Europe. And according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention here in the U.S., 60% of U.S. drug overdose deaths in 2010 were due to medications, the majority of which were prescription drugs. So that's a significant trend here in the United States and throughout the world. If you look at the various levels of drug abuse by drug category, for many years, cocaine was always number 2 to marijuana. Marijuana is sort of the undisputed champion of drug abuse, but number 2 nowadays, and for the last several years here in the U.S., has been this category of psychotherapeutic drugs. So the sedatives and the tranquilizers, et cetera, all combined as a category, are number 2 and not close to marijuana, but way ahead of cocaine and opiates here in the United States, and somewhat reflected in the trends that are occurring in other countries as well. Just if you go down to that last bullet here, marijuana, of course, still the most widely used illicit drug in the entire world, according to this yet another report, 180 million users, or nearly 4% of the global population between 15 and 64, at least for the year 2010. We know that in the United States, as more states are legalizing marijuana, either for medical use or for recreational use, as in Colorado and Washington, that certain things that you would expect to correlate with this are actually happening. For example, there's a report out now that the number of THC-related traffic fatalities has actually tripled in the last 10 years, which corresponds precisely with the trend of legalizing marijuana for medical purposes. And so as marijuana becomes more available for legal use, we're seeing some of the ill effects of that, and we could probably find correlating statistics for other parts of the world as well. So with all of those sort of the statistics that give us sort of a view of the world in terms of substance abuse trends, let's talk now about the policy. And when you look at a comprehensive drug-free workplace program, the policy is number 1. That's where it all starts. You've got other components, of course, that are essential, like supervisor training, employee education, of course, the drug and alcohol testing and all the components of that, certainly employee assistance in some way, fashion, or another. But the policy is really where it starts. The policy is the cornerstone of your program, whether you're just talking about the United States or actually anywhere else in the world. It would be silly and foolish to have a drug testing program in today's litigious environment without having a policy in place. And the components of a policy are basically going to be the same whether you're talking about a U.S.-based policy only or for virtually any part of the world. When we do a policy in the United States, we'll write that policy based on the state that the company is headquartered in, and then we'll add amendments to it for every different state that the company is in. Well, you can't really treat different countries as simple amendments to a main policy. Because the legal requirements and restrictions are so different from country to country, even within the European Union, you almost have to treat every country as a separate policy. And some companies do that here in the U.S. They'll have a separate policy for every state that they're in, a separate policy. But in other countries, if you're doing business throughout the European Union, for example, you would definitely want to treat these topics here that are on the screen perhaps separately and uniquely from one country to the next, depending on the various legal requirements that come into play. Now, a good policy begins with a purpose statement, which is really sort of where you articulate your drug testing objectives. And so it's not sort of a throwaway statement at the beginning of a policy. It's very important. It's kind of like writing a term paper back when you were in college, and you would use the introduction to your paper as where you really say what this paper is going to be about. And the same is true with the purpose statement in a policy. This is what this policy is about. This is why we're doing the things that are in this policy, so that, one, it's very clear to the reader, what your program entails, but also it's clear to you as the employer exactly why you're doing this. Your objectives are articulated in the purpose statement, and your policy becomes a reflection of those objectives. So there are lots of reasons why you would do drug testing. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but those would be articulated in your purpose statement. And then you would, of course, just like here in the United States, but very important when you're talking about international drug testing policies, you want to make sure that you're very clear about who can authorize a drug test and who within the company, within country by country, is qualified to answer employees' questions, or supervisors' questions for that matter. And then who does the policy apply to? Job applicants? Perhaps, but which ones? Employees, full-time, part-time, etc. And very importantly, especially in many European countries, but in other nations throughout the world, union workers, workers who are under some type of labor agreement. Now, what you'll find in many countries is that there are national labor laws, national labor agreements that have a direct impact on drug testing. But you may find that it's on a company-by-company basis. You need to determine that so that if all of your workers come under some type of national labor agreement, that's reflected in your explanation of who's covered by the policy. Supervisor training is very important. These first few bullets here are the common components of a supervisor training program, but very, very important, even in the U.S., of course, but internationally, that there is training on the confidentiality of the program. This is very important, especially in European countries, and any kind of union agreements that affect the program so that the supervisors or the managers who are sort of carrying out this program on a day-to-day basis are aware of exactly what the parameters are for what they can do and what they cannot do. And so confidentiality, very, very important. Privacy laws in other countries are paramount when it comes to drug testing, unlike the United States, where privacy laws can affect it, like in California. It has a very big effect on a California-based drug testing program, but you don't see it as much. And part of that is because many states have drug testing laws, and so you'll find confidentiality language in the drug testing law. All states, or most states, have some type of privacy provision in their state constitution, and that's where the California caveat comes. But internationally, you find that national privacy laws are a big part of every possible way that you deal with employees, but especially in terms of something as sensitive as substance abuse or your drug testing program. And the same applies for employee education. These are things that you want to articulate in your policy, but again, you want to make sure that you're very clear on confidentiality and the availability of healthcare services. It may not look exactly like a traditional EAP program that you might have as an employer here in the United States, but it might have some of the very same components. And so you want to be clear about that when you educate your employees, and as you write your policy, that you're explaining exactly what you provide in terms of what we would call EAP services, because in other countries, sometimes the health codes and the health regulations of that country will require employers to have some type of a healthcare service policy or program in place for their workers. And even though that country may not have a drug testing law, the language in that national health care or health code or regulation will have a direct tie back to somebody who tests positive for drugs, and what the employer can and cannot do about that, and what obligations the employer may have to provide some services or make some services accessible to that worker who tested positive. And we're going to talk about consequences here in just a few slides, but that needs to be in the policy, and you need to follow your policy, because if you are ever challenged in how you dealt with an employee who tested positive in terms of, again, traditional EAP type services, you're going to want to be able to go back to your policy and show this is in writing, this is what we do, this is our policy, it's been communicated to our employees, and we follow this policy in every circumstance involving a positive drug test result, so that there's consistency, there's no hint of discrimination, and it's the policy. It's here in writing. And so whether we're talking about a traditional employee assistance program or something a little bit more akin to what a particular country might require, it's written in your policy, okay? And then you're going to want, of course, have a prohibited conduct section of the policy. From country to country, you'll find that this can be pretty consistent. Somebody who tests positive, for example, somebody who shows up to work under the influence of drugs, or, heaven forbid, somebody using drugs or misusing alcohol while at work, and some of the other things that normally come into play, like cheating or drug test cheating, adulteration, refusing to cooperate. These should all be articulated in your policy, regardless of what country you're in. And in all the research that we've done, and over the last few years in conjunction with DISA, we've actually researched dozens and dozens of countries to find out what drug testing laws they have or laws they have that affect drug testing. And I haven't run into a country yet where you would be prohibited from having this type of prohibited conduct language in a policy. There may be language in a national law that would affect how you respond to a positive drug test, but nothing that would prohibit you from including that in your prohibited conduct section of your policy. And then, of course, the core of your policy is going to be how you do drug testing and when drug testing occurs. And this becomes a key issue, in many states here in the United States, of course, but certainly in other countries. And so your policy has to be very clear. If there's some type of random testing component in a policy, which in some countries you can't really do random testing, or random testing would be very narrowly limited to workers in certain types of safety-sensitive positions, and usually that's what you're going to find. You need to have that very clearly written and explained in your policy, so that, for one, the management at a certain location is clear about what they can and cannot do, and so that there's no inconsistency from one location of your company to another. But also on a national or country-by-country basis, you're very clear that in this country we can do this, but in this country we can't. And you'll find that, just like in the United States, from state to state there would be restrictions. Say Minnesota, for example, which only permits random testing of safety-sensitive workers, versus here in Florida, where I live, where there are no restrictions on random testing. Okay, you might find that, or you definitely will find that, from country to country. And in my mind, I keep thinking of the various countries in Europe, but this would apply in South America as well, where we've done extensive research on international laws, Australia, New Zealand, and some of other parts of the world. We've done Singapore, Malaysia, etc. You'll find that there are restrictions, but that in most cases, within a very narrow scope of the definition of random testing and who it can apply to, you can do random testing in most countries. But there are some that do not allow it and others that restrict it. So this has to be clearly stated in your policy. That's why I'm saying that on a country-by-country basis, especially when it comes to international drug testing programs, you're going to want a policy for each country as opposed to an addendum to a base policy for this country or that country. It becomes a little bit too complicated to try to cover different countries as addendums to a general policy. And so Here again is what we talked about at the very beginning. Why you drug test determines how you drug test, and that is going to be reflected in the language in your drug testing policy. And there are lots of reasons why companies do drug testing, safety being the number one objective. In some parts of Europe, you will be required to, as an employer, to provide some type of care or service when it comes to the health and well-being of your workers. That will actually be a legal requirement that is applicable in some countries. And so those things become components of a drug testing policy, or let's call it a drug-free workplace policy, that you might not necessarily have in your U.S. drug testing policy. You may, but it would be very different, especially given the fact that in some European countries, you're mandated to provide some type of care or service when it comes to the health and well-being of your workers. So that may be your objective for doing drug testing, because and there are countries where you can make the justification of drug testing because of the requirement to provide some type of care or service relative to the health and well-being of workers. If so, you're going to want that to be in your drug testing policy or in your drug-free workplace policy. And here again, you can go through this list a little bit later on your own, but these are some of the common reasons that you normally come up with drug testing policy objectives and purposes. Consequences, just like in the U.S., very important to be fair, to be consistent. Your options, sort of splintered out among these three here: termination, suspension, treatment. There will be different levels of suspension, for example, or treatment, and what happens if somebody does not complete a treatment program or somebody refuses to participate in a treatment program. Again, you would treat that subject on a country-by-country basis, because it's going to be very different from country to country. And whether or not you can terminate somebody for a first-time offense of the policy, as opposed to how you would treat somebody who has repeated offenses of the policy. And again, very, very different in how you would treat employees versus job applicants. And that's very similar to the United States, where job applicants have a significantly reduced expectation of rights versus an employee who's already on your payroll. Now, Sean and I did a webinar together back in November last year when we talked about international collection issues. And so as I sort of went through the basics of the collection issues in some countries, we then brought Sean in, and Sean talked about some of the very specific issues that he has dealt with in putting programs together, arranging collection services throughout the world for DISA clients. And so today we're going to talk about some of the issues that come up with drug testing that you're going to want to treat very carefully in your drug testing policy. And so these are some of the things that Sean came up with that he deals with on a daily basis that would be, sort of a very logical tie-in to a policy. For example, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Sean here in a second, but if we were talking about drug test panels, for example, you may be mandated by a company that you work for to use a certain panel, or you may have a panel that your company wants to use, or you may be actually required by some countries or to have a certain panel, or you may be following the best practice guidelines that come from the European Workplace Drug Testing Association, where you would follow their panel recommendations. Regardless, you're going to want to have that in your policy so that very clearly it states these are the substances we test for, these are the cutoff levels we use, and therefore if there is ever a challenge to a drug test result, you can always go back to your policy and say, this is the panel we use in this country. These are the drugs, these are the cutoff levels, and it applies to every worker who's drug tested. And so right there in the policy, in this one little issue, panels, drug test panels, you can show that you are consistent. This is what we do. This is what we do every time, whether it's the president of the company or any one of the employees of the company. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is bring Sean in to talk about some of the issues that he's dealt with in terms of putting programs together internationally for clients as it relates to, or how it might relate to, how a company formulates its policy. So Sean, let me turn the mic over to you.
Okay. Yeah, so for example, when you mentioned part of the thing on the panels, this something just came up recently. For example, in parts of South America, you have things about different types of substances that are used there, in Australia, things like that, where, for example, people will recreationally chew, some form of tree bark or a leaf, and concerns are that it'll show up as maybe an amphetamine or as even a cocaine derivative. So one of those where you consult with maybe a medical review officer and go back and see whether or not your levels are where you want them to be, or more importantly, referencing back in the policy why your levels are the way they are, and having them to be enforced on a local level. As Bill's been mentioning, the reason the policy is so important is because in a lot of countries the drug testing culture is less defined, and a lot of people are not familiar with it. So the basic general overall goal of all this is to make sure that they have a real easy to read reference guide to be able to go back to on probably a regular basis while they get familiar with the program, to know not only why they're doing it, but how to do it and where to go to ask questions for it in a timely manner. So here, for example, on the panels, and also if you are using local laboratories as opposed to coming back to, say, the United States to eliminate turnarounds or cost reasons, different laboratories in different countries have different panels that are available. So you'd also want to reference that in your policy, particularly if you're going country to country and using those as options, or even if you're using local laboratories as an option for emergency type testing, say for post-accidents or reasonable suspicions, which is definitely something to consider in your policy, particularly if you're working for customers, as they are making it increasingly frequent requirements that you have in your policy set up to know who to go to, both as far as management and collectors, to set up the test to make sure it's done within a window that's not too far different from Department of Transportation. So somewhere in the 8 to 32 hour range is typically what you're seeing.
And Sean, can we pivot over to specimens? You brought up some interesting things when we were getting ready for today's webinar in terms of how you might consider hair testing versus urine versus oral fluid, depending on the country that you're in.
Yeah, so this is where cultural concerns can come in a lot. So, for example, with hair testing, particularly in the Middle East, although I've heard of it in some other areas, where culturally, cutting hair is either a religious or a cultural issue there, you may have to amend your policy to either not include it or have options for other means to be available, similar to how you would here in the United States for an employee who has a medical condition where they can't grow hair. And then in other countries, it's more of a privacy issue of, say, urine collections where you actually have the availability of, say, an oral fluid or a hair test instead. So basically, for your policy, it's important to have kind of the culture on the ground, as well as the general mindset of employees and labor agreements and things like that as far as your methods for testing. And then on top of that, it's availability of collectors in the area, particularly when you get involved with alcohol testing, and particularly if you start getting involved with post-accidents, et cetera. Because of availability, they're not all collectors in all areas, say, for example, have breath alcohol machines. So you're looking at either saliva or sometimes even blood testing for alcohol. And then it's important in your policy that you have, again, clearly written guidelines for the availability of what types of specimens you want to collect and how you treat them for availability if they're not available. As far as the laboratories go, there's, depending on the area, there's obviously you're not going to find a SAMHSA certified laboratory pretty much anywhere outside the United States. So a lot of other countries have clearly written guidelines as far as for their laboratories if you decide to go outside the U.S. EWDTS has very good best practice guidelines for most of Europe. And then when you start going outside to other countries, Australia has their own guidelines, Malaysia, etc. And so it's important that you have in your policy for each area exactly what guidelines that you have, so that when the drug test inevitably gets challenged, that you have researched and written down exactly in your policy what your requirements are and to be able to follow them. And exactly the same way for your point of collection type testing. So just like how Department of Transportation here has guidelines on all their various kits, you would want to do the same thing in your policy for other areas, referencing exactly what product materials you're using and preferably even why and what qualifications they've gone through. And also very important through all this is in your policy to make sure that you reference how you train both the collectors as well as the supervisors and even the administrators that are receiving the results, so that the entire chain of custody process for any type of collection is able to be easily followed and, more importantly, be referenced after the fact if someone has any questions about how it was done.
Sean, let me interrupt just for a second to give our audience the website address for the EWDTS. That's the European Workplace Drug Testing Society. I think I called it the association earlier, but it's the European Workplace Drug Testing Society. So it's EWDTS, as you see on the middle of the screen right there, .org. And then you can find those best practice guidelines that Sean was referring to.
Okay, so so here's referencing back to the chain of custody guidelines, which again, because drug testing is not something that is regularly done in all countries, it's important in your policy you have written out for everybody that's involved in the whole process, all the way from the employee to the supervisor, collector, laboratory, and MRO are usually less than an issue because it's something they regularly do. But you have the medical review officer, for example, particularly referenced in your policy, because not all countries even know what a medical review officer is. So you're putting in your policy the why they exist, how they are used, how the employee contacts them, what the company is allowed to know versus the employee, what requirements the medical review officer has. So, for example, when you start getting into, say, Sweden, for example, the guidelines for who is a medical review officer are different than here in, say, for the United States, where I believe there's 4 different organizations that provide accreditation for a medical review officer. In Sweden, it's anybody who's a qualified medical review officer a qualified doctor with some training, but they don't have any specific accreditation programs over there. Now, on the reverse side, all of their nurses, all of their MRO agents have to be registered nurses, where instead here in the United States, they just require some specific training. So even for countries that do use medical review officers, the culture is different, so you want to have clearly referenced in your policy who you're using, why you're using them, and how they're used. And again, if you're having something as far as different types of substances used, make sure you have referenced in your policy the panels and levels and how they're handled with the the protocol for the medical review officer. So this is something actually we were going over just recently over a lot of Latin America specifically, but as far as consequences go, each country is going to be very different as far as how they look at the consequences for, say, positive results. In a lot of countries, it's considered a medical disease of type. So back to referencing guidelines where you would want in your policy to be able to have the wellness and treatment of your employees in mind. So you would have to set something up for that, versus other areas where you have the horror stories of, say, for example, China, who view the consequences of their testing as significantly more serious, which is where you want to have written in your policy how that's handled in each country, both for legal and cultural reasons. Also very important, even outside of legal requirements, is your labor agreements in each country, making sure that it's recommended that you at least consult them when you're creating your policy so that they're aware of what's going on to prevent disputes from going on in the future. And again, that has to do with who's going to be covered in, say, a random program or tested pre-employment in the first place, versus consequences of how they're handled. And again, for your corporate culture in each country, because not all countries are used to the reasons for why you do the testing, is why you're in your policy. You have everything in there about why your consequences from both a safety-sensitive perspective as well as the health of not only the employee who tested positive, but the health of everyone around him.
Now, Sean, I'm going to kind of take the audience through one of the national charts that we created at DISA, and that'll give you a chance to kind of look through some of the questions that have been submitted by the audience, in the chat and Q&A section. And then I've got a couple of questions for you that I'll come back to. But I just wanted to show our webinar attendees today, sort of the broadness of the issues that you're dealing with when it comes to a drug testing policy, particularly internationally. So this is a chart that we created for Finland. It's a little bit older, although I'm not aware of any national law changes in Finland that would affect the chart. But and I apologize that the writing's very, very small, and I hope that you can make it out. If you can't, when you get a copy of the slides later, you'll be able to see it a little bit more clearly. But right at the top, and all of our charts look like this, so we break it down very, very specifically by different components of a drug-free workplace program. So at the top, it's the policy issues. And the very first thing is a written policy requirement. So again, we're speaking about the country of Finland here. But it is required that you have a written policy. Now, is this a good practice no matter what? Absolutely 100%. But if you are in a country that requires it, there may be specific guidance or regulations as to what's in the policy. So, for example, for Finland, the comment that we have on the Finland policy requirement is the employer must have a, quote, written comprehensive action program on alcohol and drugs, end quote, and subject to audits by the occupational health care service provider and annual updates. And that's right there in the Occupational Health Care Act of the country of Finland. So remember at the beginning I said some countries don't actually have national drug testing laws, but others do. Others have, in the case of Finland, the Occupational Health Care Act. Okay, so it's obviously dealing with, it's the occupational health or the health of the workers in their places of employment. They also have something called the Act on the Protection of Privacy in Working Life. So in Finland, some countries don't have a specific privacy law for employment situations, but in Finland they do. It's the Act on the Protection of Privacy in Working Life. That's what they call it. But they also have the Occupational Health Care Act Section 19, which we can derive from that regulations that would affect drug testing. So throughout this chart, you'll see examples of that. For example, going down just a little bit to consent to testing, in most cases, employers only process information about an employee's health if the, quote, if the information has been collected from the employee, him or herself, or elsewhere with the employee's written consent. That's very, very different than you're going to find in the United States, and, but not all that different than what you might find in other European countries or Asian countries, for example. And then we get into the specific drug testing issues, whether or not applicant testing is allowed. You see there are restrictions that apply in Finland. It's limited to workers in certain types of occupations, and that's denoted in the Occupational Health Care Act. Reasonable suspicion, limited to employees in positions designated, and we have a note section to this chart. So we put what's there, but how it defines it is justifiable cause to suspect that the employee is under the influence of drugs at work, or that the employee has a drug addiction, and if testing is essential to establish the employee's working or functional abilities. And so the positions that reasonable suspicion drug testing would be limited to are found in the notes section of our chart, but in addition to that, there would be other certain restrictions that would apply. And you see there's nothing for random testing. It's not mentioned in the Occupational Health Care Act or in the Privacy in Working Life Act. But based on the restrictions that apply to other types of testing, like applicant testing and reasonable suspicion testing, it might be wise to refer to those lists of positions that are permitted to be required to subject to reasonable suspicion testing if you're going to do random testing in those countries. In other words, limit your random testing to the same list of occupations. Then if you go down a little bit, we get into issues of specimens, drug panels, whether instant testing's allowed or not. But you'll notice under status that there's a lot of not mentioned because a lot of these issues, as Sean referred to, are not covered in any kind of national laws. There are some. You see chain of custody protocols required, and it's because Finland sort of punts on this issue, and they defer to the EWDPS guidelines. That's another thing that you'll find in many European countries is that they haven't developed actual regulations for, say, collection processes, chain of custody protocols, or direct observation or anything like that. They'll simply defer to the guidelines from the European Workplace Drug Testing Society. And so you would go to those guidelines, and if you go to that, you'll find that there are guidelines for lab-based urine testing, instant urine testing, oral fluid testing, hair testing, etc. And you're going to want to be able to include that reference, if not specific guidance from those guidelines, in your drug testing policy. And the next slide actually shows a continuation of the chart. It's a smaller section of the chart, so I was able to blow up the image a little bit bigger. Again, it's very small. I apologize for that. But you'll find, again, that there are some not mentioned, and in some cases, confidentiality required, but under the Privacy in Working Life Act in Finland, but not unlike you might find in other countries, especially in Europe and parts of Asia and the Middle East. Very, very important that you're not simply looking for a drug testing law, not finding it, and assuming there are no laws that affect drug testing in whatever country you're researching, that you look for other laws that affect drug testing. And in particular, you're going to want to research health laws or health regulations, health codes. You're going to want to research privacy or confidentiality laws that exist in a country. You're also going to want to look for labor agreements, national labor agreements. And within those national labor agreements, you're going to look for privacy issues. You're going to look for specific drug abuse, drug testing issues, maybe even drug treatment language that might be included in a national labor agreement. You're going to have to, sort of expand your search a little bit, be a little bit more creative, look for other types of laws that could be related to a drug testing program or an employee screening program, so that you're not simply giving up the search when you don't find a drug testing law itself. In some countries you will, but in many countries you won't, and so you have to expand your search into these other related issues and areas. All right. So we did have some questions. Sean, did you have a chance to review any of the questions yet, or do you want to go through some of those now?
I did, actually. So one of them went back to asking about different panels. I think one asked specifically about the cocaine derivative thing I brought up a moment ago. At this time, all the policies that I've currently run into do not allow an acceptance for, say, these other types of substances that may come up in recreational use. For example, because the policies are typically referencing back to either customers who are ultimately, United States based, or in areas where clients are doing testing, say, for government requirements for, say, for example, Peru. They're actually borrowing rather heavily for the panel off of the Department of Transportation program in the first place. While it is definitely something to consider for how you set up a, say, internal corporate policy for non-customer or related means, particularly if you're testing people outside of the traditional safety sensitive, I haven't personally run into anyone who's allowed that currently. But that's certainly something that you would want to have a conversation with your medical review officer and to put into your policy if that's something that you decide to do after consulting, say, with local management in the country.
Now, Sean, one of the things that came up in our last webinar that seemed to be of significant interest to our audience was the whole issue of dealing with language barriers in other countries. And of course, you're often able to find somebody in another country who speaks English, but maybe not the language of drug testing, for example, or that understands it well enough to read it and really sort of be able to, discern what's in a policy. So do you ever run into issues where you need to provide some type of translation in order to be able to ensure that you're communicating accurately?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, a number of times I actually had to write it in two different languages consecutively, particularly when you're actually coming back to policies, both in South America and in, say, parts of Europe and Asia. It's been particularly important to have it in a couple, three different languages so that everybody, both here and there, are able to read it properly, and up to and including even the collectors who, because a lot of them are medical staff, yes, they have a passing understanding of English generally, but it's very important that particularly when you're doing anything in writing, either make sure they're fluent enough in English in the first place, or have it available in their language anytime, which we've done in helped assist for in a number of areas, say, for example, Romania, where, in fact, for them even, as far as like reading results or point of collections, it actually has to be the doctor that does it. So it's very important, particularly for countries like that who are used to very, very well-written guidelines, that you have everything written down for them in something that's clearly easy for them to read.
We ran into that recently when we were doing the DISA International newsletter. We were writing an article on the new law in Brazil that requires applicants for commercial driver's licenses, what the equivalent of a commercial driver's license here in the U.S., to submit to a hair test before they
Correct.
can actually get their license. And a lot of the articles, as you can imagine, that we were finding were in Portuguese. And so, you have the option of using one of the various online translation programs, but I actually gave the information to an attorney friend of mine who speaks fluent Portuguese, and found that, some of the information that the translation program, the online translation program used, was not as accurate as you would find.
They're limited.
Yeah. So very important.
I have used them on occasion to get a basic understanding of other people's say policy writings they have done, but on occasions where I've tried to lean on using an online translator to try and communicate with a doctor in other areas, it's very amusing to get a response back in English saying, I'm sorry, I have no idea what it was you actually tried to say in my own language. Why can't we just, use English? So it's definitely something it's a tool, but it's something to be very careful about.
Okay. Another thing that you brought up earlier in today's webinar was the fact that chain of custody forms can look very different in other countries compared to what we might be used to using in the United States and Canada even. Can you comment a little bit on that in terms of, again, the language issues that might come up and ensuring that in your policy there's, sort of you're taking into account that you're using forms that are going to provide all the information that should be in a typical chain of custody form?
Yeah. So, for example, you have a lot of the Sweden, Norway, for example, who obviously each laboratory is going to have their own chain of custody form, so that helps significantly as far as how it would look and even what language it would be in. But more importantly is what the information is going to be expected on there. Everybody in the United States is used to how Department of Transportation has constructed it, where the account and the MRO and everything are clearly written on there. But in some other countries, unless you set up something specific, their chain of custody forms, say for example, don't have any reference to the employee on there at all, including their ID number, at least not sent to the laboratory. So depending on what laboratories you're using depends on what kind of information you're going to expect to get back from them, which again makes it very important that you have written down who's going to be accessing that information so that they make sure that they can be able to put, basically what information they're getting back from the lab and match it back to the results that they're expecting, for example. And obviously vice versa, you want to be careful that, if you're in a culture that wants to limit for data privacy and et cetera, the information that's around, that your chain of custody form reflects that and isn't, for example, putting the guy's name and national ID number right there on the top of the form and then being freely distributed to anybody in the office, because that can be a very serious concern, just as it's a concern here in the United States with Social Security numbers.
Okay, Sean. Well, we're out of time. I thank you, Sean, for your excellent part of today's presentation. Let me just say as a concluding comment that I know that some companies try to sort of take their U.S.-based policy and just use it everywhere in the world. And sometimes that will work to a certain extent, but oftentimes you'll find that given the things that we've talked about today, labor agreements, privacy laws, healthcare regulations, and health codes that exist in other countries, that you really do run the risk of getting yourself in a little bit of trouble, if not some big trouble, trying to directly apply a U.S. policy to your drug testing program in another country. And so we always recommend that you look at that and you look at the various laws that apply in the countries that you're in to make sure that you're in compliance with all the different laws and regulations that apply to your company on a country-by-country basis. And that's obviously a service that DISA can help you with. And with that, thank you very much for being on today's webinar, and I will turn the call back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Sean. On behalf of DISA Global Solutions, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.